For bipolar especially, the DSM-5 says that actually, probably, this is how everyone's brain works. All humans fit on what we would call the bipolar spectrum. And so, if you just draw a line, it's probably a bell curve, like most statistics that involve humans. Probably a bell curve. We all fit somewhere on here, but most of us are just right here as far as how bipolar we are. And then the DSM says at a certain point, our bipolar is getting in the way of our life. And that's when we call it a disorder. So we could say, like, maybe this line here is bipolar type 2. It's getting in the way of our life in some way. But we are also making millions of dollars with our different business ventures. But it doesn't meet the criteria for a disorder unless we lost the house because of our gambling problem or some other thing. I would call this type 1. You cross this line, you almost always end up in the hospital. Our bipolar type 1s almost always end up in the hospital. Seasonal affective disorder, we're not sure, but it sure does seem to cycle throughout the year. So we could call that maybe somewhere in here.
You call me crazy? Maybe.
But most of, when it's this time of year, like I was driving here and it was already starting to spit a little bit of rain and snow. And I thought, man, I'd much rather just turn around and go home, crawl back into bed. So we do most people tend to have less energy in January. The key with seasonal affective disorder is that D, the word D, does it get in the way of your life? And so,
Have you ever seen it where it's almost like opposite, where like springtime and summer people are struggling more than?
Well, that's actually when suicide rates spike.
Yeah.
So it does actually seem to be definitely true that people struggle more in the springtime.
Yeah.
And we don't know why. But one of my thoughts is, and we see this with our rich and famous people, finally make it big as a movie star, finally win the lottery, and then they realize, I'm still sad. I achieved absolutely everything I could possibly imagine, I'm still sad. So then when spring rolls around for somebody that's been kind of struggling all winter, and the grass is turning green, and they're still sad, they're like, well, what? I thought I was supposed to be magically happy. And then the other component to that, which I believe holds true for all mental illness, is simply inflammation. One of the reasons I enjoy giving the hemodynamics lecture is because I believe in the next 10 years, the hemodynamics lecture is not going to be separate from the mental health lecture. It's all the same thing. And if we talk about what septic shock looks like, what kills you in septic shock? It's your own immune system that kills you in septic shock. That's all it is. And so, for example, we like to think that some bacteria that you got in your bloodstream is what killed you. It's not. It's your body's reaction. And it's an over-the-top reaction. That's what you die from in septic shock, to the point where if we culture someone's blood who's in septic shock, only 50% of those people ever grow anything, any bacteria. They don't even have any bacteria in their bloodstream. So if you think about influenza. Did everybody get their flu shot? I'm assuming you guys all did. It's about 47% effective this year, which is nice. It's almost 60% effective for kids, which is nice. Those are the ones that tend to die from influenza. Do you remember the last great pandemic? I mean, you don't remember it because it happened before you were born. Does anyone know what the greatest pandemic the world has ever seen? How many, like from sheer number of people that died? It wasn't the zombie apocalypse, because that hadn't actually happened. Even though World War Z is my absolute favorite zombie with Brad Pitt. I recommend reading the book if you haven't, if you're a fan of zombie apocalypse movies. The book, World War Z, was about zombie apocalypse. And the guy that wrote the book was an epidemiologist who modeled the book after the last great pandemic that killed off a fourth or a third of the world's population. And it was not the Black Plague. That's what we tend to think about. It was influenza. The Spanish flu in 1918. And so if you read the book World War Z, he just traveled from country to country trying to gather data on influenza deaths. The reason it was called the Spanish flu is because we were in World War I at that time, and no country was allowed to report death statistics because of wartime news reporting. France and Germany and the United States, Japan, nobody could report how many of their citizens died at any given point in time. So once we started collecting the data, the influenza of 1918, which started just south of here in Kansas, mind you, at Fort Briggs in Kansas, it just killed hundreds of millions of people. But what was unique about that influenza strain? We think about influenza, which is your H1N1. Why did it kill so many people? And the people who died from influenza in 1918 were not the sick and elderly. The majority of deaths were 20-year-olds, college students, very healthy people. Why is that? Because that strain of influenza, for whatever reason, it wasn't the influenza that killed people, it was their own immune system. And so the healthier your immune system in 1918, the more likely to die. More likely to die, to the tune of hundreds of millions of people. What does that have to do with mental health and the bipolar spectrum? We were talking about people that get sad in the spring. And there's definitely a correlation with bipolar disorder and asthma and allergies, hay fever. How many people start suffering a little bit when the pollen count goes up? And it's miserable. All that hay fever is an immune response. Probably all that bipolar is an immune response. There's a few other things, and I didn't know this until just last week. I was reading some interesting research, but we know that schizophrenia is a spectrum. which means, if you take to a logical conclusion, all of us fit on that spectrum somewhere. And in the DSM, it's called schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Autism, we've known that for years, that it's a spectrum, which means everyone has some of those traits. And the research I was just reading last week, we're going to talk about anorexia today. Anorexia. They're seriously considering putting that on the autism spectrum. Because many of the traits, such as perfectionism, obsessing about one thing and being unable to let that one thing go, a lot of what we call traits of the autism spectrum disorder really seem to manifest in anorexia. So it's not, I don't think it's a question of us versus them. It's a question of how bad are my psychotic paranoid delusions? Have I crossed that line to where it's now a disorder? And what if I was able to decrease all the inflammation in my body? Would all those symptoms go away? I don't know, the science isn't quite there, even though it probably is there with anxiety and depression. But for most of these other things, it's not quite there yet. I'm just reading this, I got this email today, which I think is fascinating. If inflammation in the immune system is the cause of everything, wouldn't it make sense that if an antidepressant helps people be less sad, wouldn't it make sense that maybe the way it's working is by decreasing inflammation? Well, that's the email that dropped yesterday. As it turns out, an antidepressant drug used to treat OCD could save people from deadly sepsis. New research from the University of Virginia reports. Ain't that something? It's all one and the same.